On the 30th of January 1649, Charles I's head was severed from his body. This anointed king was killed in the full light of day with the backing of Parliament.
This brutal act of regicide comes after 7 years of war that divides towns, friends, and even families.
There is nothing civil about civil war. They have seen so much suffering and death and destruction. They've just had enough.
I'm historian Lisa Hilton, and over 3 episodes I'll trace, day by day, hour by hour, the 5 weeks that led to one of the most seismic moments in our constitutional history, the trial and death of Charles I, a king anointed by God.
No king in England had ever been put on trial for any charge, let alone treason. It was unprecedented.
How did the nation effect this radical step, the reverberations of which are still felt, even to this day?
What they did do, change English law and politics forever.
Hidden within these weeks are the chance events, secret manipulations, and revolutionary actions which led to this ultimate decision.
How did a country kill its king?
It's Christmas Day in the year of our Lord 1648. King Charles I is spending Christmas imprisoned in Windsor Castle. He has lost the Civil War after being captured 18 months earlier by his enemies in Parliament. Charles eats alone, reading the Christmas service from his Book of Common Prayer. His family are in exile, his beloved wife is in Paris, his eldest children are scattered across Europe, the youngest are in parliamentarian custody in England. There's no family Christmas for Charles this year.
And here in Windsor, Charles isn't the only one having a quiet Christmas. The Puritans are in power, and they've done their best to ban what they consider to be a pagan festival. There are laws making the exchanging of gifts, the wearing of fine clothes, feasting and dancing punishable with a hefty 5-shilling fine. It's not exactly festive.
So in London, Christmas Day 1648 is like any other working day. Markets are open, working men and women go about their business, and in Parliament there's no recess.
And today they're urgently debating the future of the country. That all depends on what to do with the king. In theory, the king and Parliament should work together, but the events of the past 7 years have put an end to that. MPs now speak openly of Charles as a man of blood, and they demand that he be made to answer for the horrible violence of the Civil War.
Amongst the MPs sitting that day is Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell comes from a relatively humble background. He's been an MP since 1628, but his early life and career were unremarkable.
Cromwell's not someone who stands on ceremony. He's not impressed by any of that. He famously dresses very shabbily, he has ill-fitting clothes, his hair could do with a comb. He's once seen with blood specks on his collar, he's cut himself shaving. And this is sort of part of his shtick, really. He famously once said that he would rather have a plain, russet-coated captain who knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else.
Cromwell had some sort of nervous breakdown in his 20s, which he later referred to as his melancholia, and from that point on was a devout Puritan.
We know that Cromwell had a religious conversion in the late 1630s, which turned him into the kind of Puritan he was. It's always a dialogue between him and God.
But Cromwell is up against a king who is absolutely convinced of his divine right to rule. Charles believes that he's answerable to God, not Parliament. But the reality is that he's a prisoner of Parliament. And for the last 3 years, they've tried to get Charles to agree to limit his power.
Parliament keep negotiating. They keep going back to Charles, saying, you know, come to terms with us, come to terms with us. And these negotiations are going on and on and on.
Cromwell by nature is a negotiator. He wants to have a settlement between the army and Parliament and the king. What he wants is for the king to come to some kind of constitutional settlement, to something that's like a modern constitutional monarchy.
So far, Charles has refused to compromise.
He was not prepared to give up. He was not prepared to deny his God. He would not agree to that, and that was demanded of him.
For him, it's very simple. You know, his will is God's will, and he is accountable to no earthly authority.
As night falls on Christmas Day, in a last-ditch attempt, Cromwell sends one of his parliamentarian supporters, the Earl of Denbigh, to reason with the king.
The story goes that Charles refuses to see Denbigh and turns him away without even hearing the offer from Parliament.
It seems inconceivable that this deadlock is ever going to be broken. The time to negotiate has come to an end. Tomorrow, Cromwell and Parliament will have to think of a new way to resolve this stalemate. Charles wakes up on the 26th of December. Once he would have spent the day celebrating the feast of St. Stephen, and his servants would have enjoyed their Christmas boxes. Instead, today, he follows his usual routine as a prisoner at Windsor.
So Charles in Windsor, it's not great for him. He's used to space, he's used to majesty, he's used to his own servants. Now he's got army guards, and it's quite a strict confinement. You know, he's got a guard on every door. He doesn't have his family, he doesn't have his friends.
So Charles was becoming increasingly confined. When he'd been imprisoned at Castle, he had at first been allowed to walk around all the grounds. A very physical man, he liked riding, playing bowls, but he'd become increasingly confined. Carisbrooke had even been allowed to see a woman who was reputed to be his mistress, and he sort of wrote her rather racy letters saying that he wanted to meet her in his private closet and give her a good swiving. Anyway, there was definitely no swiving to be had at Windsor that Christmas.
Parliament does allow Charles to have a servant of their choosing, a gentleman of the bedchamber called Thomas Herbert. Herbert later writes an account of his time with the king.
In his memoir, Thomas Herbert describes how Charles spends his days. Mornings are devoted to prayer, and in the afternoons he takes exercise, walking here on the North Terrace at Windsor. According to Herbert, Charles likes this spot best because it has a very delightful view of the River Thames, with many pleasant hills and valleys, villages and fine houses far and near.
Charles has no way of knowing how long this prison life will go on. He doesn't know that by the 26th of December, Parliament has had enough of his refusal to compromise. Now, whispers in Whitehall begin that the king might be put on trial for treason.
Can a king commit treason? Pretty difficult, you know, when you've got the 1351 Treason Act, which makes it a crime punishable by death to compass or imagine the deposing of a king or to fight for his enemies. So the law of treason is really fashioned to protect the king, not put him on trial.
So how, by Christmas 1648, had this shocking proposition come about? 7 years of civil war has left the country devastated. Battles, skirmishes and sieges took place the length and breadth of the country. Nowhere and no one was left untouched.
You know, for the vast majority of the people, they've just had enough, you know? They just want to get on with it. They want to move on with their lives. You know, there is nothing civil about civil war, and they have seen so much suffering and death and destruction. And I just think they just need closure. They need to move on.
And by Christmas 1648, the winners of the war believe that the blame for all this bloodshed lies at the king's feet.
The troops were demanding justice, a great cry of justice on this man of blood. And they had good reason, because the war that the king started back in 1642 had killed 1 in 10 Englishmen, more comparatively than died in the First World War. 1 in 10 Englishmen were lying dead in the muddy fields of Marston Moor and Naseby and so on, and many more were injured and were permanently injured. The towns were full of beggars who were trailing a lost limb from the fight with the king.
I've come to Leicester, a city that suffered horribly under siege by Royalist forces, to look at a collection of petitions from local residents.
The characteristic action of the civil wars was not a set-piece battle, it was an attack on a fortified strongpoint. And if an army broke into a town and terms of surrender hadn't been made, then they could unleash a wave of violence, a wave of retributory violence that would have led to murder, robbery, cutting, maiming, and rape.
An appalling list of consequences for someone who's effectively an innocent bystander.
These documents, over 300 years old, are compensation petitions. Their claims for damages trace a litany of human tragedy.
What are we looking at right here?
Well, here's an example of one of those petitions from William Sumner, a tailor in the town of Leicester, to the mayor and alderman of the town, complaining that when the king's forces sacked Leicester in 1645, they'd killed his son, and that his house had been pulled down, and with the fright whereof your petitioner's wife hath been distracted ever since.
It's such a vivid connection reading about William's wife being distracted, and she suddenly becomes a real person. Is that something you've experienced going through these archives?
Well, yes, we've found many similar stories to this one of people overcome by grief.
How many of these petitions are in existence?
We estimate there are about 4,000 petitions of this ilk in the county record offices in England and Wales, plus a huge amount more in the National Archives as well.
Being in the archive gave an immense jolt of empathy, suddenly seeing the casualties of the Civil War not as numbers or statistics, but as real people, people who lost their families, their livelihoods, their homes. Suddenly they become immensely and poignantly human.
And as night draws in on the 26th of December, Cromwell, Parliament and the army are determined that the king must pay for all this destruction. The next day, Charles is confronted with a stark new reality. The Commons pass a law banning all court ceremony at Windsor.
The ceremonies of state stopped, all the official doffing of caps, all the expected courtesies that would be normally afforded to a king were halted, gradually signalling to Charles, if he'd been under any illusion up to that point, that the end was coming and the sense of his kingly authority was ebbing away.
Charles would have seen it as a deliberate insult to him as king. He had lived as a soldier for years. There were times when he'd been on the run, where he had slept on earth floors. So it wasn't as if he was somebody who could sort of only, couldn't stand life if people weren't sort of bowing and scraping all around him. But, he was a king, and kings were treated in a certain way, and to have this stripped away was clearly a threat and an insult.
Charles is left with one small comfort. His dogs can stay. This punitive action is part of the House of Commons' plan to put pressure on the king. By the 27th of December, the House of Commons is effectively in the hands of the new model army, the force that had faced Charles across the battlefield. But how did a military group come to control the House of Commons?
Just a few weeks earlier, on the 6th of December 1648, Colonel Pride and a battalion of soldiers from the new model army arrived at Westminster. Any MPs who still favoured negotiating with the king were blocked from entering Parliament. When the MPs demanded to know by whose power this was done, they were told bluntly, by the power of the sword. It was unequivocally a coup d'etat. The remaining 80 or so MPs became, insultingly, known as the Rump Parliament, the last remnants clinging to a stripped carcass.
And that's it. At a stroke, about 270 peers are shorn from the Commons.
The Rump, and I call it the Rump because this is not Parliament as we understand it. It's not even the House of Commons as we understand it. This is those MPs who are compliant with the wishes of the army, effectively. There's been a military coup.
Oliver Cromwell is a member of the Rump Parliament. Officially, MPs were not supposed to hold military posts, but an exception was made for Cromwell in the light of his career. Cromwell grew up in the market town of Huntingdon and joined the new model army in 1642. Cromwell is second only in the army to the Lord General, Sir Thomas Fairfax, and is a celebrated war hero.
He becomes the most able, the most courageous, the most decisive of the soldiers that are produced during the Civil War, and he comes from almost nothing.
At the Cromwell Museum in his hometown of Huntingdon, there's a fabulous memento of his military career.
Tell me about the sword. Do we know that this did definitively belong to Oliver Cromwell?
He's got his initials on it.
Where?
Just here.
Okay.
It comes down through the family, so we'd be pretty certain it's his. It's a classic cavalry sword, both for stabbing and swiping. It is a sword that a cavalry officer would have worn. It seems overwhelmingly likely that this is the sword with which he led charges into battle. I mean, one of the things we can say about Cromwell is that he never, ever left it to others to lead a charge. He was always willing to show his own courage and his own confidence by leading.
So is it the case that it was Cromwell's military career that really turned him into the leader he became?
Well, I think fairly early on he starts winning battles, and he never stops winning battles. I mean, it's almost impossible to think of anyone who fought on so many battlefields and won every time. Here's a letter that Cromwell wrote on the 6th of June 1645. So by now he's just been appointed as the head of the cavalry of the National Army, and he's about to plan the battle that is to happen at Naseby, and yet he is able to tell two of his loyal men that he'd recruited himself there's a weakness in the defences.
And the fact that he signed the letter with his full signature implies a degree of communication, of intimacy with his men, a degree of respect between them.
And it's a strong, bold signature, isn't it? Look at the way the sea is formed. I mean, the big sweeping sea. His signature on it, a handwritten note written under pressure before one of the greatest battles in English history. It's a wonderful example of this, strong, purposeful, determined handwriting of a man confident that he was on the winning side.
Cromwell's military prowess gave him huge influence, and by the 27th of December 1648, he's moved a long way from his humble roots in Huntingdon. He's moved his family to a house in Drury Lane, but he spends most of his time closer to the centre of power, Whitehall.
Cromwell is now occupying a house known as the Cockpit within Whitehall Palace. However, his critics note that he's gone even further. Not only is he living in the palace, he's actually sleeping in one of the king's magnificent beds.
Cromwell's military brilliance has got him this far, but as yet on the political battlefield, he's made no progress against the king. But all that is about to change. This morning, the Rump Parliament are sitting. What was once just a rumour has become one step closer to a reality. Cromwell is introducing a new course of action to break the stalemate. A committee has drafted an act, what at the time is called an ordinance, that the king be put on public trial and charged with treason.
To accuse a king of treason is seriously problematic on quite a few levels. Just on a basic level, how can you have Rex v. Rex? How can a king be charged with treason? And in treason trials, you're tried by your peers. A king has no peers.
When the ordinance is read, there's uproar. So shocking is the very idea that Henry Elsing, the clerk of the court, leaves the house in protest. For any ordinance to pass into law, it has to go through the parliamentary process of the day.
It would be initiated in the Commons, it would be read a number of times, it would then be sent up to the House of Lords, who, if the House of Lords confirmed it, would then pass into, it would pass into law.
But to pass this ordinance is an even greater challenge than usual, as what is being proposed has never been considered before.
In the past, monarchs have been deposed, they've been forced to abdicate, they've been killed. But what has never happened before is no king in England had ever been put on trial for any charge, let alone treason. By even suggesting having a treason trial, the only punishment for which is death, is in itself treasonable.
What makes Cromwell embark on this mortally dangerous path? There's a clue in the powerful speech he delivers to the House.
If any man whatsoever should carry on the design of deposing the king and disinheriting his posterity, or if yet any man had any such thing, he should be the greatest traitor and rebel in the world. But, since the providence of God hath cast this upon us, I cannot but submit to Providence. It sounds like a riddle, but basically what he's saying is that since God has put them, the parliamentarians, in this position by allowing them to win the war, then he has no choice but to submit to God's will and try the king.
Providential thinking is very simply this idea that God's hand is in everything. So whether it's something small like, I don't know, toothache or a cannon backfiring, or who wins a war, or even, whether or not you should put a king on trial for his life. People are looking for God's hand in this. Everything is part of God's greater design.
What this means is there's a tremendous anxiety about Puritanism. One is always looking for God's providence. And, of course, the most obvious sign of God's providence is victory on the battlefield. If one wins, then God must want you to win, and you are thankful for that. But again and again, Cromwell refers to this idea that they are merely God's instruments.
It's really the key to him, I think. He's always looking for God's approval or God's direction in everything he does.
The problem is that at Windsor, Charles is also equally convinced that he's God's representative on earth. Charles spends much of his time at worship, following the services in the Book of Common Prayer.
The Book of Common Prayer is really the order of service for the Church in England. It's the liturgy, it's the prayers, it's all the things that the Church was expected to do and the way that services were supposed to be conducted.
Charles is defying a Puritan law by following this book, as they have banned it.
The Puritans found the Book of Common Prayer very much a Roman Catholic document, or at least something that smacked, as they would consider it, of popery. It wasn't the vision of a much more equality-based service. It was too ceremonial. It was too much like Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. It was too much like Mass, which had been outlawed.
There are 2 books in Trinity College, Cambridge, which embody the difference between these approaches to God, one of which is Charles's personal copy of the Book of Common Prayer.
It is wonderful to think that this is the very book that Charles held in his hands, his Book of Common Prayer. Here on the cover are the royal arms, and inside an inscription, Charles Stuart Rex, a book he took out of his closet, 1648.
The Puritans may have banned the Book of Common Prayer, but they have their own godly instruction manual.
This is the Soldier's Pocket Bible, first printed in 1643 and handed out to all parliamentarian troops. It's almost like a motivational rather than a devotional manual. It's divided into sections. Each section has an instruction for the soldier and then a selection of verses from the Bible to justify it. For example, a soldier must not do wickedly. A soldier must pray before he goes to fight. And my favourite, perhaps the most inspirational, and let soldiers and all of us know that the very nick of time that God hath promised us help is when we see no help in man. So we have 2 sides, 2 books. Charles, with his Book of Common Prayer, unquestionably convinced that his right to rule is divine. And Cromwell and his new model army, marching into battle with this little Bible against their hearts, convinced that they too are following divine will.
On the 28th of December, the problem for Charles is that God seems to have shown where his favour lies. He has lost the war and is a prisoner. Within the mindset of the times, God has shown his displeasure. This evening in the Commons, the proposal to try the king does survive its first reading. It's a solution which could ultimately demand the king's life. Parliament is one step closer to ending the impasse. Word of the potential trial of the king is spreading out from London. Abingdon in Oxfordshire is a hotbed of Puritan groups and home to a commoner who now steps into the political limelight. A 26-year-old woman, the self-proclaimed prophet Elizabeth Poole, has had a vision, and she's arriving to share it with the General Council of Officers.
Who was Elizabeth Poole?
Well, nobody. Poole was a woman who had at one time lived in Abingdon, where we are now, as part of a gathered church. This was a church that took place in the kind of room we're sitting in now.
So it was a very informal church.
Exactly. There was no leader. Instead, people would perhaps listen to a sermon from a lecturer, and then they would speak as the Spirit moved them. So they believed that every person could be possessed by the Holy Spirit, speak in the power of God.
So the gathered churches were more perhaps egalitarian than a traditional congregation?
Massively more egalitarian, because there wasn't even a vicar. So they really believed that they were overturning the hierarchy of experts in favour of God's chosen spokespeople. And they argued that you didn't have to have a degree from Oxford or Cambridge to speak in the power of the Spirit, that any person could. And that really opened the door to very unconventional people taking the lead in matters of religion. People like Elizabeth Poole.
How did she come into contact with Cromwell and his fellow leaders?
She approached the Army Council because she said she'd had a vision that was relevant to them.
That's quite a confident thing to do.
Yes, it was an extraordinary thing to do, but that was the kind of moment that it was historically. We're seeing a moment where very ordinary people are finding themselves capable of overthrowing hierarchy and saying what they believe God has told them to say.
And what were Elizabeth's words? What did she claim to have seen in her vision?
Well, this is where Elizabeth really played into their hands. She had a wonderfully sustaining vision of the country as a weak, crippled, feeble woman, and the army as a strong, burly young man protecting that weak and feeble woman.
How extremely flattering.
It was indeed. And so, of course, they listened to her really attentively and endorsed her. And Henry Ireton, an army grandee, said, "I see nothing in her but the fruits of the Holy Spirit."
So what happened after Elizabeth had delivered her vision to the council? What effect did it have?
Well, they were massively keen because she told them what they wanted to hear, that they were these strong, masculine figures and that the country needed them to protect it. It was also because they really wanted God to show them some sign that they were doing the right thing.
Elizabeth Poole seems to be confirming everything that Cromwell and his parliamentarian allies want to hear. But still, they hesitate at the enormity of this course of action. If they pass a law which allows them to put the king on trial for treason, they have to accept that the end result could mean the king's death. At the Bodleian Library in Oxford, there's a document that shows the agonised soul-searching that Charles's enemies are going through.
The title of this paper is a deliberation about the execution of justice upon H.R. And the first thing that strikes me about it is how intimate it is. It's not official, it's not formally worded, it's very private. It's as though I'm being allowed to eavesdrop on a conversation that happened 400 years ago. References in the text date it fairly precisely to the Christmas period of 1648. And although we don't know who the author or authors are, it does seem that they were closely connected with the centre of power, with Parliament or with the Council. Effectively, it's a kind of rhetorical laundry list. It starts with the prose, that the execution of H.R. will stand with the justice of our cause. That is killing the king in line with what the parliamentarians fought for. At times, the document is quite accusatory, enumerating the supposed crimes of the king against his people, as here. Would to God it were otherwise, and that he knew what a stream the blood of 300,000 innocents would make. He would have thought something of a humour and of a hurrying revenge were to be quitted in himself, rather than by holding to either seek to make that rivulet a sea. Effectively, what they're saying here is that King Charles ought to want to die for shame at his crime against his own people.
And then the writer's doubts start.
So here we begin with the arguments against the execution of the king. The first of which is the state of the parliamentarian cause. It's not the case that they're all in unity. They're quarrelling amongst themselves, they're divided, no one knows what to do. There are many different interests at stake. And the authors summarise it thus: rocks have grown out of ourselves. It's a sort of horribly physical image of, yes, dispute appearing like cankers on the body politic. At the end of the list of arguments against Charles's execution, we find this: to have no kingly government at all, and then what everlasting inlets will there be left for torrents of mischiefs and machinations? It's a wonderfully theatrical phrase, torrents of mischiefs and machinations. And what they mean is, if you get rid of the king, then what kind of government you might have? Could it be corrupt? Could it be dangerous? Could it be worse than kingship itself? And so, the authors of the deliberation conclude, for these reasons, therefore, my vote is vivat rex. May the king live.
It's all too clear from this 17th century writer's meticulous rehearsal of the arguments about the king's future that at Christmas 1648 there is nothing inevitable about what will come next. As the month of December draws to an end, despite the ban on traditional Yuletide celebrations, some brave souls are determined to have fun. In London, 4 playhouses have reopened and are illegally putting on performances.
This is the site of the Salisbury Court Theatre, the last theatre to be built in London before the Puritans closed them all down in 1642. But even in the febrile atmosphere of London at Christmas 1648, the players at Salisbury Court believed the show should go on. They took the opportunity to improvise a satire on the current political situation, playing with the crown of one of the characters. This newspaper, the Kingdom's Weekly Intelligencer, offers an eyewitness account of what they did. In the way, they oftentimes took the crown from his head who acted the king, and in sport would oftentimes put it on again. The people, not expecting such a pageant, looked and laughed. But sadly for the actors at Salisbury Court, neither the laughter nor the play at a last.
Soldiers stormed the theatre and shut the whole thing down. Resistance is futile. A parliament controlled by the military is hard to defy. Trapped at Windsor, the king also has no power to act against his captors. For Charles, the best hope of salvation will either come from God or his family abroad.
Charles is very much a family man. He loves his family. The kind of aloof public persona is really quite at odds with the warm individual that he was. He adored his wife, Henrietta Maria, and she is in exile in Paris, trying desperately to get the French to help to put pressure on Parliament and the new model army.
Charles's older children, Charles, James and Mary, are in Holland. Mary's married to the Prince of Orange, and they're trying to agitate from the distance. And then there are 2 children in England. There's 13-year-old Elizabeth and there's 8-year-old Henry, and they are both prisoners of Parliament.
The 13-year-old Elizabeth, who has been writing to him, and he has written her a very touching letter in which he says that he's sorry he hasn't been writing to her much, but when he's feeling miserable, he says he doesn't want to write to her and sort of pass on the misery, essentially, and asks her to give her little brother a kiss, the 8-year-old Henry.
As the new month opens, the Rump Parliament is sitting, and once again the subject of debate is the ordinance to try the king. Since its last reading, a committee has been adding details to it.
They're a committee of the House of Commons. They have been delegated the task of drafting effectively what will become largely their charge against the king and trying to give it some sort of statutory basis.
It's a daunting task. The committee faces two huge problems. There are serious doubts amongst the MPs about the very legality of trying the king. And beyond that, there's no court or procedure through which to do it.
They're struggling to find a structure for something completely new. They could have tried to put him in an ordinary court. The Court of King's Bench would be the court in which treason trials would normally have been held. But then, under the common law, then of course they would have to have a jury. And a jury, although they can be handpicked to a certain extent, are much less capable of being controlled. And their deliberations are not controlled. So even if you think you've got hot parliamentary men in the jury, that may not be the way it pans out.
The committee have come up with a solution. They'll create a temporary High Court which will sit for just a month with the sole purpose of trying the king. And instead of a jury, they'll appoint carefully vetted, what they call commissioners, who will act as judge and jury in one. This still doesn't get over the problem of the dubious legal basis for trying a king. How can you have Rex versus Rex?
The law of treason is really fashioned to protect the king, not put him on trial. And it was a real conundrum until a very brilliant lawyer solved it for Cromwell by charging tyranny, which in our modern term is like committing crimes against humanity, killing or civilians, torturing prisoners, that kind of behavior. And of course, fighting, essentially declaring war on the English people, which the king did. So that was the thinking, finally, that broke this conundrum. Yes, a king can commit treason if he makes war, kills his own civilian people.
Oliver Cromwell is amongst the MPs debating that day, and he's been named as a commissioner. He's on the committee that's drafting the ordinance. But it's hard to find any evidence of exactly what he's doing, or more importantly, thinking at this time. There are no letters or documents detailing his thoughts or speeches.
The point is about Cromwell, he's always elusive. There is this very famous phrase that's attached to Cromwell, that he's practiced at not knowing. He's always slightly off stage. He's always someone who manages not to get his hands dirty when a major political operation is taking place.
It's a mistake made by a lot of historians to think somehow that Cromwell is doing everything and is planning the death of the king and the republic. That's not the case. Cromwell, he's in a state of wonderment. He's waiting on God. He's waiting for these divine signs.
Cromwell may well be waiting for a sign, but parliamentary process is rolling on. The majority of MPs in the Commons accept the committee's recommendations. The ordinance has passed another crucial stage, but it's still not law. To do this, it has to go to the Lords. The very next morning, the ordinance to try the king is sent up to the House of Lords. They are faced with the job of scrutinising this radical new legislation and, if they agree, taking it one step closer to making it law.
They asked the advice of the three judges who had been named as those who were to preside over the High Court of Justice, and all three judges said categorically that the whole thing was a legal farce.
The House of Lords at this stage is only really about a dozen peers, not Royalists. They're kept away. So we're talking about parliamentarian lords. They're mainly sort of veteran campaigners, people like the Earl of Manchester, who commanded the Eastern Association in the First Civil War.
Despite being parliamentarians, helping to pass a law to actually put the king on trial and possibly to death is a step too far.
There was a good deal of nervousness. The Lord Chancellor had jumped in a carriage to get away. The Lord Chief Justice had gone to the country. People of high position were well aware of the Treason Act and that it was treason to depose a king, and they were extremely nervous. So the Lords were very reluctant to deal with that. They went to water.
The Lords vote against the Ordinance and then declare that they're adjourning for a week. I think they hope that by the time they come back, the whole business will just have been dropped.
If the Lord's ploy works, it might halt the wheels of the bureaucratic machine. But if it doesn't, everything is moving towards the king's death. It's hard to know how much of this drama being played out in Westminster is known by Charles, 25 miles away in Windsor.
There is sort of a sense with Charles right now that he's sort of floating above it all, and he doesn't really seem to have comprehended the gravity of the situation. So sometimes, he might even be talking about planting melons in Wimbledon. And previously he was talking about sort of rebuilding of Whitehall. So there's this sense, I think, that he's just sort of biding in his time, and he's sure that God will protect him.
Much of what we know about Charles at this time comes from his servant Thomas Herbert's memoir. He gives little insight into the king's thoughts and feelings, but he does tell one story.
Thomas Herbert was Charles's gentleman of the bedchamber, and he tells in his account of Charles's time of Windsor of one episode where the diamond seal of Charles's timepiece was lost, and Charles instructed one of his servants to look for it, and the servant looked high and low and couldn't find it. And Charles was sort of disturbed and unsettled by this.
For Charles, denuded of the splendour of his kingly court, a loss like this assumed a huge importance.
Thomas Herbert searched everywhere for the King's seal without success. But in the next instalment of this gripping saga, he recalls that a little before His Majesty went to bed, a good charcoal fire being in the chamber and wax lights burning, the King cast his eye to one end of the room and saw something sparkle, and pointing with his finger bade Mr. Herbert to take a candle and see what it was. By good Providence, it was the diamond, which he took up and found His Majesty's arms in it, and with joy brought it to the King.
It's a sort of odd event to record, but I think it does show how, certainly as a symbol of Charles's kingly authority, the trappings of his ceremony, the splendour, the magnificence of his position gradually being lost, and he was left to kind of try and find the remnants of things like the diamond seal of his timepiece. But actually, of course, time was ticking, and really he knew that perhaps the end was coming, and certainly his kingly authority was ebbing away.
It's 2 days since the Lords blocked the Rump Parliament's attempts to pass a law to put the King on trial for treason. Hiding in their country houses, the Lords are hoping that in London the whole business has just gone away. But Cromwell and the Commons have no intention of letting this happen. Now they do something truly revolutionary.
This amazing document is the original manuscript of the House of Commons Journal, an account of the daily business of the House. It's more than just a record. It's a minute-by-minute live witnessing of the revolutionary events that were taking place here over Christmas 1648. And here we have the 4th of January. And this unassuming little paragraph is what I'm looking for. Resolved, that the Commons of England in Parliament assembled do declare that the people under God are the origin of all just power, and do also declare that the Commons of England in Parliament assembled, being chosen by and representing the people, have the supreme power in this nation. These two little paragraphs contain a revolution. They're saying that the House of Commons is the sovereign power in the country and that they have no need of the support of the Lords or of the King.
In other words, we're going ahead, Britain, or at least England, is now a republic. Although they don't realise that. They don't get what the implications of their actions are on the 4th of January. But the direct implication is that England is ruled directly by Parliament and by the House of Commons.
You know, it feels really kind of technical and you know, picky to us, but it's a kind of constitutional revolution, because what's happening is the Commons is passing an act without any intervention from the Lords, without any intervention from the King. So that in itself, well, let's say it was revolutionary.
And it's sort of circumventing parliamentary process, it's laughing in the face of the rule of law. And as Charles himself says, actually, you know, if power without law can make law, can alter the fundamental laws of the kingdom, then, you know, no subject is safe in his person or his property.
In politics, everything is moving towards putting the king on trial. The country is inching closer to calling the king to account for his role in the bloodshed of the Civil War. But God is never far from politics, and despite the revolution in parliamentary procedure, those in power still want reassurance of divine approval. And in Abingdon, Elizabeth Poole, who a week earlier prophesied that Parliament was the protector of the nation, now has a new vision.
So Elizabeth went back to the council on the 5th of January.
Yes, and that was also when she produced this.
Wow.
Which is a publication of her vision. So she went public with what she was telling them.
She sold her story to the papers?
Pretty much, yeah.
What did she actually say?
Well, this is where I would suggest that what she did was offered a gloss on her vision. Whereas the vision had been interpreted by the Council of State as this immensely ego-salving tale of them as healthy young men.
A flattering endorsement.
Indeed. Poole was evidently dismayed by the way that they interpreted and, in a way, nicked her prophecy as an endorsement to put the king on trial for his life. She said something that really devastated the council's egos. She recast her vision and explained that for her, the king was the husband and Parliament, including the Army Council, were the wife. And therefore, she said, I'm afraid you can't divorce your husband, because that is the case in English law. You never heard, she said, that a wife might put away her husband. And then to make it a bit worse, she went on as follows. For all that pass by and behold her will say this was a strumpet and not a faithful wife that rejoiceth at the fall of her husband. And contrariwise, the faithful wife mourneth in secret for him. So she's now casting Parliament as strumpet-like.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because from being sort of a strong, virile, masculine figure, Elizabeth is then, in terms of the time, reducing them to a feminine role,
Right.
and one which is sexually intemperate, strumpet. I mean,
Yes.
strumpet means tart, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we think our parliamentary language is violent now.
Yes.
I think you would probably be rebuked by the Speaker if you called Boris Johnson a prostitute.
That's
The
quite
Army...
courageous.
Yeah, exactly, but you can also go with the Army Council not overjoyed to hear this.
What was the reaction of the council to Elizabeth's words? How did they respond to that?
Very unenthusiastic, as you would imagine. They strongly wanted to be able to say, see, God is totally on our side.
The 5th of January is known as Twelfth Night. the night when Christmas celebrations come to a raucous end. It's a night of misrule, when lords become servants and servants lords. The world is turned upside down. Elizabeth Pool's new prophecy could have upturned Parliament's course of action. But for Cromwell, events have now overtaken any doubts. In his providential worldview, the fact that the Commons are now the sole power in Parliament shows where God's favour lies. So for Cromwell on Twelfth Night, everything is, ironically, in order.
But for Charles, this night of misrule is fast becoming a permanent reality.
On the 6th of January, 2 days after the Commons have made themselves the supreme authority in the realm, they pass a law to put the king on trial for treason.
Finally, the stalemate is broken. Parliament have made their move. Now the king will be forced to account publicly for his part in the Civil War.
The Commons choose Colonel Miles Corbett to inform the king. He's known amongst Royalists as bull-headed, splay-footed, bacon-faced Corbett.
According to reports, Charles receives the news with his usual calm. Later, he comes to walk here on the terrace, looking sadly towards London. No one, he says, has the right to try him except his God and his conscience. Cromwell has decided otherwise.
During the 12 days of Christmas, what was once almost unthinkable has now become reality. Parliamentary procedure has been overruled and fundamental constitutional change made.
To try a king for treason is such an outrageous, outlandish thing. I mean, this is a man that can cure people just by touching them. You know, there is something Christ-like about him to many people. So to try him is not only radical, but it's almost blasphemous.
A law may have been passed in Westminster, but now the challenge for Cromwell and Parliament is to enact it. It just hasn't ever been done, and nobody really knows how to put a king on trial. Next time, the tension rises in London.
The people of London are in a state of great uncertainty, they're fearful, they're edgy.
Some of Cromwell's allies get cold feet.
We're talking about deal or no deal. It's been called bargaining with menaces.
And Parliament struggles to find enough men willing to look the king in the eye and sentence him to death.
They knew that most of these people would not take part.